So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events, events, that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Michael Lewis's new book, The Fifth Risk. And this is from the prologue, which is titled Lost in Transition. Chris Christie noticed a piece in the New York Times. That's how it all started. The New Jersey governor had dropped out of the presidential race in February 2016 and thrown what support he had behind Donald Trump. In late April, he saw the article. It described meetings between representatives of the remaining candidates still in the race: Trump, John Kasich, Ted Cruz, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders, and the Obama White House. Anybody who still had any kind of shot at becoming president of the United States apparently needed to start preparing to run the federal government. The guy Trump sent to the meeting was, in Christie's estimations, comically underqualified. Christie called up Trump's campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, to ask why this critical job hadn't been handed to someone who actually knew something about government. Lewandowski said, "We don't have anyone." Christie volunteered himself for the job, head of the Donald Trump presidential transition team. "It's the next best thing to being president," he told friends. "You get to plan the presidency." He went to see Trump about it. Trump said he didn't want a presidential transition team. Why did anyone need to plan anything before he actually became president? "It's legally required," said Christie. Trump asked where the money was going to come from to pay for the transition team. Christie explained that Trump could either pay for it himself or take it out of campaign funds. Trump didn't want to pay for it himself, and he didn't want to take it out of campaign funds either, but he agreed grudgingly that Christie could go ahead and raise a separate fund to pay for his transition team. But not too much, he said. And so Christie set out to prepare for the unlikely event that Donald Trump would one day be elected president of the United States. Not everyone in Trump's campaign was happy to see him on the job. In June, Christie received a note from Trump advisor Paul Manafort. "The kid is paranoid about you," Manafort said. The kid was Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. Back in 2005, when he was U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, Christie had prosecuted and jailed Kushner's father, Charles, for tax fraud. Christie's investigation revealed in the bargain that Charles Kushner had hired a prostitute to seduce his own brother-in-law, whom he suspected of cooperating with Christie, had videotaped the sexual encounter and sent the tape to his sister. The Kushners apparently took their grudges seriously, and Christie sensed that Jared still harbored one against him. On the other hand, Trump, whom Christie considered almost a friend, couldn't have cared less. He'd invited Christie to his and Melania's wedding, and he pressed him to attend his daughter Ivanka and Jared Kushner's wedding. "That would be awkward," said Christie. "I'm paying for the wedding, and I don't give an S," said Donald. Christie viewed Jared as one of those people who thinks that because he's rich, he must also be smart. Still, he had a certain cunning about him. And Christie soon found himself reporting everything he did to prepare for a Trump administration to an executive committee. The committee consisted of Jared, Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Paul Manafort, Steve Mnuchin, and Jeff Sessions. "I'm kind of like the church elder who double counts the collection plate every Sunday for the pastor," said Sessions, who appeared uncomfortable with the entire situation. The elder's job became more complicated in July 2016 when Trump was formally named the Republican nominee. The transition team now moved into an office in downtown Washington, D.C., and went looking for people to occupy the top 500 jobs in the federal government. They needed to fill all of the cabinet positions, of course, but also a whole bunch of others that no one in the Trump campaign even knew existed. It's not obvious how you find the next Secretary of State, much less the next Secretary of Transportation. Never mind who should sit on the board of trustees of the Barry Goldwater Scholarship and Excellence in Education Foundation. By August, 130 people were showing up every day and hundreds more working part-time at Trump Transition headquarters at the corner of 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. The transition team made lists of likely candidates for all 500 jobs, plus other lists of informed people to roll into the various federal agencies the day after the election to be briefed on whatever the federal agencies were doing. They gathered the names for these lists by traveling the country and talking to people, Republicans who had served in government, Trump's closest advisors, recent occupants of the jobs that needed filling. Then they set about investigating any candidates for glaring flaws and embarrassing secrets and conflicts of interest. At the end of each week, Christie handed over binders with lists of names of people who might do the job well to Jared and Donald and Eric and the others. They probed everything, says a senior Trump transition official. Who is this person? Where did this person come from? They only ever rejected one person, Paul Manafort's secretary. The first time Donald Trump paid attention to any of this was when he read about it in the newspaper. The story revealed that Trump's very own transition team, led by New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, had raised several $1 million to pay for its own staff. The moment he saw it, Trump called Steve Bannon, the chief executive of his campaign, from his office on the 26th floor of the Trump Tower and told him to come immediately to his residence many floors above. Bannon stepped off the elevator to find the governor of New Jersey seated on a sofa, being hollered at. Trump was apoplectic, actually yelling, "You're stealing my money! You're stealing my effing money! What the F is this?" Seeing Bannon, Trump turned on him and screamed, "Why are you letting him steal my effing money?" Bannon and Christie together set out to explain to Trump federal law. Months, and it continues from there. The book is The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on our program today, we're going to get into, in our second hour, this whole question of America surviving the destruction of our government. Donald Trump took a rather major step yesterday with an executive order basically telling every regulatory agency in Washington, D.C., that they can just basically stop enforcing the rules if they think that that will produce an economic benefit, a.k.a. profits for corporations. We'll get into that in our second hour. In our third hour, Leah Garcés is with us, the president of Mercy for Animals. We're going to be talking about what's going on with factory farms in this country, and in particular, what we're learning. Germany just changed their law, for example, with regard to low pay in meatpacking houses. They just outlawed it. So we'll get into that in our third hour. But our first hour, Congressman Mark Pocan is here with us, as he typically is on Wednesdays in our first hour, taking your calls for the hour. Our national town hall meeting, Middays with Mark. Congressman Pocan is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives. And his websites are pocan.house, or his website is pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. Congressman Pocan, welcome back. I'm curious what you see as the top of the news stack today.
Boy, there's always a lot. What's front of my mind is, we were in Washington last week on Friday. The House passed a $3 trillion bill, the HEROES Act, to address what we're all facing with COVID-19. But we can't get the Senate to get off their behinds and negotiate and do something. And what I'm really worried about is those PPP loans run out pretty soon. A bunch of people are going to be laid off again. I don't know what gets the urgency under the U.S. Senate, but we did put our marker down, put a bill out there, and I'm really concerned that they're not moving faster, much less, the president, trying to hawk hydroxychloroquine, if I'm saying, or
Chloroquine. Yeah.
Chloroquine, am I saying that right? I think I'm not good at pharmaceutical names. It's just bizarre, right? That's the only way to describe what's going on at the White House, and the fact that they finally had some CDC regulations come out about reopening, and I'm afraid that this has been a chaotic process, and this president's put tens of thousands of more people's lives at risk.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way, and it is very, very troubling. Remarkable. Well, shall we pick up our phone calls? We've got the lines filling up right now. The number,
Absolutely.
by the way, 202-808-9925 if you have questions or comments for Congressman Pocan. And starting out with Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris, you're on the air.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Congressman. Congressman, in my opinion, there's a myth that says you cannot indict a sitting president. And in my opinion, this man is dismantling our country. He's a sadistic individual. Is the only way to address Mr. Trump at this stage of the game is just to vote him out? There's no other means or no other procedures available to the people to stop this sadistic devil that's in the White House? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Morris, when you have Bill Barr as Attorney General, who's not doing the job as Attorney General and instead is doing the job as Donald Trump's personal lawyer, there is very little recourse legally that we have to get justice for some of the things that Donald Trump has done. And we saw what the U.S. Senate did on impeachment and the Republicans in Congress. So honestly, at this point, I think the eye is on the prize, the November elections. I've never felt more important that we get this done. And we're going to be doing it at a very odd time. So just anything you can do looking at November is going to be unbelievably important. And don't forget, if we can take the Senate and keep the House, we actually are in a place to be able to do some things. So a lot is riding on November.
Brenda in Chicago, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Congressman. I have a question. My daughter is a public health person in Michigan, and she is texting me this morning just about the deplorable situation up there. They've got the double whammy of the COVID situation, but also just terrible flooding, not only in Midland, Michigan, which was all over the news, but also she lives in Muskegon, and I guess it's pretty bad all throughout Michigan. So I'm very concerned. She tells me that they're working with the National Guard. They're working round the clock, taking all kinds of steps. But here's my question. So I said to her, we're texting back and forth. I said, I certainly hope that, you're going to get, I was sort of facetious, a lot of assistance from Trump. And she was very discouraged. She said, Trump hates Michigan, blah, blah, blah. So I'm very angry that Trump apparently uses politics to determine who gets help. But here's my question. I'm just kind of having a brainstorm. I texted back to my daughter, you guys ought to bombard Betsy DeVos's office. She's high up in the Trump administration. She's from Michigan. The DeVos's have a ton of money. I said, you guys ought to email her, call her, fax her, and just plead for help for Michigan. And I just, maybe I'm going crazy, but I'm just very concerned, and I just wanted to get your take on all of this.
Yeah, Brenda, I think you're close. I would say have them bombard their members of Congress and the U.S. Senate because you've got a lot of swing districts in the House in Michigan, and those are the people that are going to have to tell their leadership that they could lose their seats because the president's not acting. Honestly, Betsy DeVos cares about people who look and act just like Betsy DeVos, and that's people with multiple yachts and who are obscenely, morbidly rich at this point, to use a Nancy Pelosi word. And I don't know if Betsy DeVos is going to suddenly rise to doing something useful, but I do think that the elected officials who are on the ballot this November are really going to have to respond, and I think those should be calls because there is an urgency. I met with the regional director for FEMA, and I'm pretty sure Michigan is in our region for FEMA. And, I feel bad for them in that I believe the people on the ground are trying hard. Part of it is hard to get supplies in some areas. Gowns, we're down to 10 days worth of gowns in Wisconsin, and that's it. And that's a real problem. And that's more than just Wisconsin, across the country. But we really needed a federal government to get this right in January and February and March and April and May, and they're still not. And because of it, we are all at a disadvantage because of how this administration's done this. So you're right. I think they should call their elected officials, not necessarily Betsy DeVos, and call members of Congress in Michigan, especially the Republican members, and try to put some heat under them.
1 minute to the break. Jimmy in Avon Park, Florida. You got a quick question for Congressman Pocan?
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure. Thank you, Representative Pocan. And my concerns is about the chicken and all these meat packers that have the virus, and meanwhile they're working on the line, packing this chicken up, and with the hams, whatever, and is that virus being transferred to the food?
Yeah, so Jimmy, I can tell you, they've said they have no instances yet of anyone getting it from food. So that I'm not concerned as much as I am hugely concerned about the people who work in those facilities. And that's why in the HEROES Act that we passed, we had OSHA protections for more workers. And that's part of why we need the Senate Republicans to act, because we didn't get those, unfortunately, in CARES 1. The Republicans wouldn't do it. We need to get those protections for especially people in meatpacking right now.
Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program, our national town hall meeting with Congressman Pocan that happens pretty much every Wednesday right here in the first hour of the program. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and represents the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
His website is Pocan, POCAN.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, Rep Mark Pocan. And welcome back. Lowell in Salem, Oregon. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman and Tom. As we know, many bad things came out of the 80s, from hair bands to superdelegates. But one of the really bad things that came out was taxing unemployment. Is there a way that Congress can reverse that tax? Because that's been in just since the 80s, 1986.
Yeah, Lowell. So superdelegates, I believe, go back to the 70s. So just want to clarify that, but I totally agree with you on hairbands. On taxing unemployment, yes, Congress could always do that because it just got put in place, a few decades back. I don't know if you're going to see the Senate Republicans or this president move towards that, but I agree with you. It doesn't make a lot of sense already. It's not like anyone's getting by large living off of unemployment. In some states, it's even lower than in places like Wisconsin, and I really don't know how they do it. So, yes, it's possible, but probably not possible with the current political environment.
Terry in Eugene, Oregon. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you. Good morning, Congressman Tom. My question is, and this might be an ignorant question, what power is Trump using to stop investigations of his administration? For example, if the Senate or Congress calls for an investigation or questioning, how is it that he can stop that from happening, and how do we change that if possible?
Well, there's a couple things. One, he's firing inspector generals that are within the administrative ranks, which he has some authority, at least as he's looking at it, to do that. But secondly is they haven't helped us in any investigations because they don't reply to things like subpoenas. And he's just saying executive privilege, I believe, is what the answer is on that one. But he's not cooperating, and we can't do anything other than the legal process, which can take, honestly, 6 to 7 years to perhaps get through. And if you got something really quick, it might be 2 years. So he's just doing what no other president really has done at the level he's done. We're not quite exactly sure how to get around some of that because the legal process timeline is not our friend. And right now with the firing of the inspector generals, we're really concerned because that's even before we can even get to a process to investigate something. He's getting rid of the people who are investigating his administration, his agencies within his administration. And again, that's pretty unprecedented.
James in Hollywood, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan. 1 minute to the break.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Congressman. We need a real simple bill to save the post office and thus save the election and perhaps save the world. The simple bill is $10 billion to the post office with 100% congressional oversight, transparency, so the new Postmaster General.
Let's let Congressman Pocan respond to that, James. It's a great suggestion.
Yeah, James, so we did add the $25 billion requested by the Board of Governors that they requested in the bill we passed last Friday. Donald Trump has been fighting over that, partially to privatize it, partially to fight with Jeff Bezos. But I think at the end of the day, it's wildly popular. Postal Office will be able to fix that. What they really need is to get rid of the weird provision they have that they have to prepay all their employee benefits 75 years into the future. No other agency has to do that, and that hurts them more than anything.
Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. It is coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com. Yeah, well, one of them actually said that women who are on birth control pills, that should be reason to fire people. Right? I mean, it's just insane. You can check it out over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour in our nationwide town hall meeting, Middays with Mark. Margie in Alexandria, Louisiana. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good morning. Thank you so much for taking my call. My concern is I'm asking about this medication that he says he's taken. I would like to know in all details, because I don't believe he's taken it, because the guy is a big liar. He is not taking it. He's saying this to get the conversation off of the real problem about the virus and all these people dying. So my question is, how can you divert back to all the news people, go back to what's important? Don't hit on what Trump is diverting to, because that's his strategy. Stay on what's important. These people's lives are important, Congressman, and please have them to stay on that. And the mental state of the president, what can we do? Is it time for Article 25 for this guy to be got out of office? Please, y'all do something. Something has to be done. Thank you for taking my call.
Yeah, I hear you, Margie. On our 25th Amendment, I just don't think you're going to see his cabinet do that. So, it's something that we all know he's crazy, but the people around him are crazy enough to work for him, and therefore that must null out any ability to deal with it. The problem is it's really the mainstream media go to his press conferences, and they really need to quit doing that. I mean, for the longest time, he would ramble on for hours, and all I ever want to hear from is Dr. Fauci, really, because I want to hear from the medical professionals. But when they give him the coverage, of course, they're going to give him some rope and let him go out there and say the crazy things he is. The problem is, I really, what he's doing is so problematic, because I see the Twitter traffic, people who are claiming that this is fine to use now, which is really stupid because there's no proof that this will work. But this is a drug that people use with lupus and other things, and I have a niece with lupus, and they ran into a shortage issue about a month ago, potentially because of this. So, the president is doing a lot of damage just being Donald Trump. And once again, I wish the mainstream media would take him on a little more aggressively. You've seen some reporters start to do that. They ask a good question, and his only answer to come back is, "Oh, that's nasty," and he doesn't answer it. But if they keep going and let him get away without answering, he's never going to answer a question. We're keeping on focus with the bill that we need more support for people, and we're asking people to reach out to senators and put some pressure on them.
Kathy in Indianapolis, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, guys. Tom, you got the greatest show out there. I have two things, actually. First thing is, why are the Democrats not fighting to reverse Reaganomics and help the middle class? I mean, why has that not been a priority? Also, along with one of the other followers, I'm feeling so hopeless about the firing of the IGs and any oversight, and why can't Congress push the courts to make it, to speed it up? I don't understand why that can't be done.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll answer the second question first. The courts are independent, separate branch of government, and we can't. That's just the problem we have. The good news is, Nancy Pelosi formed a select committee for oversight that Congressman Jim Clyburn, the number 3 in the House whip, is chairing. He came yesterday on a phone call with the Progressive Caucus, and they're doing a lot of meetings and they're doing oversight, so they are trying to do what they can to help highlight the deficiencies that are happening. To the bigger, broader question, I think this is a question a lot of us in the Progressive Caucus often are putting out there. We know that there's so much more we need to do around income inequality and social injustice, and we're trying to fight for those issues. The good news is, I think, on the COVID packages, the House Democrats have been focused on workers and families, and that has been the priority, whether it be extra money for unemployment, helping small businesses so they can keep people employed. I would like them to go further, and I think that's part of our jobs, is to call our elected officials and ask them to go further. But largely the focus has been in the right place. I think there's more that could be done, and that's why we keep fighting for some regular payments to people, better support for small businesses to keep people employed. The Paycheck Recovery Act that Pramila Jayapal has introduced is one of those issues that we really are fighting for. But I think it's a little too simplistic to say that there's no one fighting against some of those bad policies. The problem is, we need that grassroots pressure on elected officials to listen to those of us who are trying from within to have those debates.
Kit in Boulder, Colorado, 45 seconds to the break. You got a quick question for Congressman Pocan?
Yes, gentlemen, thank you. Pocan, kudos for going toe-to-toe with the BBC a couple weeks ago. I heard that and saluted you. My question is, how often as a citizen and what words should I use when I try to call my representatives and to influence them? I just need a sort of a guide of how to speak to them, what words to use, and how frequently I should be calling them. Thank you.
Yeah, Kit, great question. I don't know if we'll have time in the seconds, but what I would recommend is, don't yell at them, don't call them names, but let them know you'll hold them accountable in the election and that you have expectations for them. And I think when you do that, we know you're watching, and that's the best way to try to influence them. And maybe we can talk a little more about this some other time.
Sure, we'll pick it up on the other side of the break. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives. Pocan.house.gov is the website. Rep. Mark Pocan, the Twitter handle. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters slaves, feudalism had lords serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff. Schemes, our book for the day.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, Dr. Michael Mann is here on heat, sea levels in the Amazon. Oh my. Environmental scientist and writer Dana Nuccitelli drops by on Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans documentary. He explains how it peddles dangerous climate denialism. And journalist David Sirota is exposing the coronavirus cover-up. In Geeky Science, I'm discussing the importance of biodiversity and how the future of the Amazon may depend on tapir poop. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Middays with Mark, with Congressman Mark Pocan, taking your calls for the hour. Joe in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. You are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman. I'm a commercial pilot for a major airline. I just wonder what the federal government's going to do to reinstill the confidence of the passengers, i.e. get temperature checks and actually maybe give them a quick test for the COVID before they get on the airplane. I'd just like to wonder what you guys are doing about that.
Yeah, Joe, I'll tell you, that's going to be hard. I saw already we're having a hard time getting the confidence back up. And, I had a fly to D.C. last week, and while there's a few more flights than a few weeks ago when, I was on a flight with 9 people out of the 150 seats, and there's only 2 flights from Chicago going to D.C., it's still not a lot better. The problem is there's no test right now, I think, that can give you that quick enough, that in the quantity that you need to test every single person. So we don't have that in place at all. I suppose you could require the temperature checks, et cetera. But I was very unhappy to see the 3 major airlines recently say that they're not going to require people to wear masks inside the planes, because that's the thing, I think, where many people are afraid that it's like a flying incubator. And if you have people just because for political or other reasons don't want to wear a mask, then that puts people, I think, still at risk. And I think that's part of the problem. So it's not even a government answer. It's the airlines, I think, have to go back to the what they said. Everyone was going to wear a mask. But to have them say they're not enforcing it, I think was a huge mistake. And I think they're going to have to assess that, or else public confidence is going to be hard to get back.
Angela in Bowie, Maryland. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, thanks, Tom, and thank you, Congressman Pocan. I'll make this quick. What is the central message of the Democratic and Progressive parties? I don't see that. I would love to see that actually announced, and every Democrat hold to that and every progressive hold to that. And more importantly, I'd like to see Dems and progressives jump in front of a mic every time, even if they're next to a Republican, to really spot what they're trying to do. And last, my real question is, why don't the DNC hold open contests to ask people to submit commercials and pick the best ones to promote? Because clearly the DNC needs help. I'll take my message off or answer off air.
Yeah, I hear you, Angela. I can't speak for the DNC to what they do as far as seeking advice and input. The House Democrats for the last 2 years, our slogan essentially has been for the people. And that's what we ran on 3 big principles last cycle. And I assume we'll be doing something very similar this cycle. And that was a big improvement, because 2 years prior, I think they gave us a 16-point plan to go talk about in November. And, that never is a very useful way to do it. But really the contrast is there's one political party that's fighting on behalf of working families. And we've been saying that, whether it be on the COVID response or on the bills that we made as priority bills. We had 10 priority bills that we put out this session and passed. So that's there. I think the difficulty, Angela, is something that Tom and I talk about, I feel like almost every single week, is that, all too often the mainstream media, if they don't pick it up, you would think it didn't happen, but they don't pick it up. And if you think about it, the average newscast on TV is 22 minutes. And what you put on that newscast is really because of how the news departments are run in aligned with the rest of the network. It's to make the most revenue in the 8 minutes of commercials. So you don't always get some of the things that we're talking about covered, and sometimes the silly gets covered. And I don't have a direct answer from that, other than you can listen to things like Thom Hartmann, and there's other sources you can read and try to watch in order to get that information. But trust me, it's something we often puzzle over and try to figure out how to break through that clutter.
Shay in Jacksonville, Florida. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good afternoon, Congressman Pocan, and good afternoon, Tom, and everyone else out there in America and all over the world. Congressman, to your last point, and then I'll get to mine, the way that you get the attention of the media is that you do in kind what is done to the American people by Trump and his administration. You meet them where they are with fire. The mealy-mouthed, trying to always be politically correct. You can't do that and expect to draw interest. If they came out with something to say that was understood by most people and not political speak all the time, but just speak plainly to people, because we know what's going on out here. We're living it every day. And that's the problem with why a lot of people are not voting as well, because they're not hearing people speak directly to them. And you can say that you're for the people, but to my point of why I call, when you go into negotiations with the Senate and you know their positioning, and you go in and you do not have a strategy, and you take shorts, such as you go in and you ask for $2,000 and you get $2,000 a month or whatever, something sustainable, and you come out with $1,200 check. That is very disrespectful. It's disingenuous, and it's very upsetting. So when you come in and things come out as being woefully short in addressing the sustainability of the American middle class, the working poor, and poor whose backs the wealth is created upon, and then we get nothing. And this is like the third or fourth iteration of the stimulus package. This continual shortfall for us, while the monies for the wealthy and the corporations are guaranteed, this is the problem. So until that is fixed, until we truly see that government is working for us, it causes a disconnect. And so, yes, I believe that the progressives and the Democrats are fighting for working people over the GOP. But when the rubber meets the road, we're the ones out here being pushed back into a workforce that's not safe. Airlines and all of these people agree to one thing, and then they do the other. And so there are loopholes and stuff that they're continually getting away with. And
Shay, let's let Congressman
Pocan
answer your question. Thank you.
Yeah, Shay, first of all, let me give you a simple math equation. The House is run by the Democrats, the Senate's run by the Republicans, and the White House has Donald Trump, a Republican. So they have 2 out of the 3 negotiating positions, essentially. So we were able to get $600 a week surge for people on unemployment. That's 36 million people who are unemployed at no fault of their own. And that was unbelievably significant, because that puts most people at the median income of what people make in this country. And we did get a number of significant things. Quite honestly, I think a check going to people who already have a job isn't as high a priority as making sure that maybe people have a job, so that you don't have to be on unemployment, so that you don't have to be on food assistance. That's why the Paycheck Recovery Act was really important, although there's another vehicle that happened in the bill we passed on Friday using an employee retention tax credit. We're trying to still fight for the employee or the Paycheck Recovery Act, because I think it'll be stronger. But there are things that happen because of the Democrats. And I think, the thing that Tom and I have talked about is Tom often gets the press releases when we do press conferences for the CPC. And we've got some of the best bills out there, from the Green New Deal to, War Powers Act, making sure that we're stopping the administration from doing what they're doing down the line. And so often it's not covered by the mainstream media. And again, it's not just talking strongly. We talk strongly, and we've had these issues. They don't cover the very press conferences all too often. So there are people fighting and trying to. The problem is if it's not picked up in that 22 minutes on a corporate media broadcast, you don't necessarily know it unless you're listening to Tom or sometimes through social media and some of the grassroots groups that work with us on these things. So people are fighting for you, Shay, and I'm sorry that you feel that someone's not. I just wish more of this information would really get out there, and it is really one of the toughest nuts we have to crack to figure out, and it really would help us towards November.
Congressman, we just have a minute till this next hard break. Just before the last break, somebody had asked you what's the best way to influence members of Congress, and we ran out of time, and I forgot to bring it back. So let me give you this minute to respond to that.
Yeah, two things I think I'd say. One, I mean, no one wants to be yelled at or screamed at, and unfortunately a lot of people do that, and I can tell you I don't listen to those folks, even if they agree with me on issues. It's not the way that humans interact, and I don't recommend that. But two, holding people accountable and let them know that you're going to vote and mean it, and ask for yes and no answers. When someone does this, which I'm nodding my head for those of you who aren't watching, all that means is I have the muscles in the back of my neck that allow my head to bob. That does not mean yes. So you have to get yes or no out of people, and if they say they're going to get back to you, okay, when? And really hold them accountable to get the answers that you want. And if you do that, you will go much farther in getting your goals accomplished for the issues you care about.
Great. Congressman Mark Pocan is taking your calls for the hour. It's Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program, our national town hall meeting. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the big cheese of the progressives in Washington, D.C. He also represents Wisconsin, the 2nd District of Wisconsin, the U.S. House, pocan.house.gov.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And you can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, Rep Mark, M-A-R-K, Pocan, P-O-C-A-N. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Steve in Topanga, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Congressman. My observation is that I keep hearing that we can't get anything done. I mean, all the bills the House sends over to the Senate, they get drawered or buried. And the Republicans control the Senate, and the president, the Republican, controls the presidency. So nothing can be done until we vote them out. And my strategy would be to inform the public about voter suppression. Tom's book on the war on voting and Greg Balance's The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, that should be the focus of the Democrats, because the only real solution that I've heard is to vote them out. And without a huge blue wave, with all the voter suppression that's going on in the red states, we don't have a chance. So I think that's where the Democrats should focus on how you're being cheated of your vote. And, everything else is mute until we turn this election. That's what I think, and I'd like to know what your response is, and I'll take it off the air. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Steve.
Sure, Steve. One thing, there's always the argument over process versus product, I think, and, people want to know why they should vote, right? So just telling them that someone's taking away their vote, while that should bother a lot of people, and we do that, and we've passed H.R. 1, the very first bill we passed this session was around electoral ethics and campaign finance reform, you still need to give people a reason to vote. So that's why I think you have to talk about the very issues that people talk about in their kitchen, at their kitchen tables, in their homes, that matter to them. It's about you, them, not about a lot of other issues. So I still think we have that task to do. But, Steve, I do think that we still have a lot of local governments that are not completely Republican-controlled. We still have a lot of state governments that aren't. And we can still enact change in those areas and honestly have those things in place for when we do turn the Senate around and defeat Donald Trump. So I'm not saying it's all hopeless. It is certainly more difficult when you have a Republican Senate and president, because the president can veto bills in the Senate. We don't have the votes. But we have passed a lot of things that show people what the difference difference could look like. I think we need to get those messages across, and quite honestly, we need people to be our messengers in getting those messages across with their social media and through their friends' networks. But at the same time, agitate for change where you can at the local and state level, because we can still get good things done, and I don't want to make it sound like you can't. It's just right now we are going to have a more difficult time getting the strongest possible COVID package when you have Mitch McConnell as the head of the Senate and Donald Trump in the White House.
Congressman, 45 seconds to the break. What if the Democrats take the Senate and the House and the White House in the next election, God willing, please? What would your priority be? What should be the first legislation? Where should we begin?
You know, we haven't talked about what the priority ones will be for this year, but I don't think they're that different than what they were last cycle. Healthcare, ethics in cleaning up what is really happening in Washington, and dealing with people's jobs and infrastructure. And I think now especially that's going to be resonating because of what's happened because of COVID-19. I think those are still the big three that we know people talk about the most in their homes, and therefore we need to be responsive to the issues that people care about the most. And, we need serious reform to make changes in those other two areas. That's why I think that issue is a real key part and a central part of the argument.
Great. Thank you. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment. Thom Hartmann here. Did you know that Chief Justice John Roberts, back when he worked for Ronald Reagan, came up with a way that Congress and the White House could get around the Supreme Court? Specifically, they were trying to blow up Roe v. Wade and Brown versus Board, but it could be used by Democrats right now. It's fascinating. It's in my new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, available wherever fine books are sold. Welcome back. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Diane in Madison, Wisconsin. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, Mr. Pocan, I would like to know why Congress does not call Trump out on his lies. And I'll take my answer out there. Thank you.
Yeah, Diane, we do every single day, every single hour, probably every single minute. I follow a lot of my colleagues' Twitter accounts. We're constantly doing that. Whether or not the mainstream media, corporate media picks it up, I can't speak for them. But, I mean, all you need to do is look at my Twitter account. I'm your representative. You'll see me doing it out probably 10 times a day, as do almost every member of Congress, as do our leadership, as do the Senate. Senators that I follow as well. So it's happening. The problem is, again, that 22 minutes you have to do all news in order to sell detergent. It's often hard to get some of these points actually covered. Therefore, we have to use alternative media. I mean, you're listening to Tom for a reason, because you're getting the truth. We need to find more sources like that, and we need to use our own social media to share these sources so people can also hear what's going on.
Susan in Phoenix, Arizona. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Oh, thank you, Congressman Pocan. My question is, I understand that in order to solve this COVID-19 crisis, we need to know the data, and testing is important. Here I am. I just heard on Rachel last night that Arizona is not releasing any of the data, and, of course, we're the lowest in testing. How do we expose this, and is there any way we can make it happen that the governors release this information and do better to follow up on testing? Thank you.
Yeah, so Susan, great question. And first thing I would say is, fight it in your own state. Fight it through your local media. Fight it on your social media. Figure out how to raise the awareness, because you're right. A number of governors, Republican-leaning governors, aren't releasing data to make the president look better, but we're doing it by not releasing things like deaths and other data that we need in order to stop the virus. So it's insane. It's crazy. But this president feeds off of that. Therefore, we're going to need people like you in Arizona to fight it in Arizona, and people in Florida to fight it with their governor, and people in Georgia to fight it with their governor, so that we can try to have a better snapshot. But if there was any top-down strategy from the White House, and there has not been. This would all be taken care of, but the president's strategy is to ignore this and to just focus on things like the stock market because he thinks that's how he gets reelected. And in the process, tens of thousands more people have died than have needed to because of the president's actions, period. And now it's because of governor's actions, period. And you need to get that message out in places like Arizona because we need you to in places like Wisconsin where we've got a governor who's trying.
Johnny in Galveston, Texas. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good morning, or should I say good afternoon, Tom and Congressman. Listen, less than 2 months ago, when I went through the drive-thru of my local Shipley donut shop, I saw all the employees there not gloved up and not wearing masks. Not wearing masks is a big thing for me, so I don't go there anymore. Likewise, I don't buy pizza at the pizzeria. I get it frozen from the supermarket, and I heat it myself because I know I've got control over how many hands are touching it. So my question to you is, if we can't do it legislatively because of the moron Republicans in the Senate and in the White House, can the Democrats in the House publish a list of CDC? Is it CDC? Yeah, CDC endorsed requirements for handling food in retail establishments that volunteers across the United States can hand out to store owners and say, we'll be watching for this, and we will or will not patronize based on your adherence to these guidelines.
Yeah, Johnny, so the bad news I'll give you first is the CDC is run by a Trump appointee, and even a couple weeks ago when they had some guidelines for reopening, they were squashed and not put out, and now they've released some weaker guidelines that aren't really even followed. So it's hard to just have the CDC put out the guidelines because Donald Trump doesn't admit there's a problem. Having said that, back to what I said about local and state governments, they certainly can put regulations out there. My county and my city, Madison, Wisconsin, and Dane County have kept in place what the governor had for restrictions for safer at home when our conservative Supreme Court struck down his provisions. So we still have something, but local governments can still do that. So I would argue that you should contact your local elected officials and see what they can do on that front. Because you're right. There's an article today in my local paper about how it's become a partisan symbol of whether or not you wear a mask, unfortunately, and only about half of Republicans versus about 3/4 of Democrats say they'll regularly wear masks. I'm with you, Johnny. I'm going to wear a mask if I'm out going anywhere, but I went to the post office a couple days ago, and no one else besides myself had a mask on. I was rather shocked. So we need to have our local governments kind of pick up where the federal government under Donald Trump has fallen apart on.
Congressman, in our last 40 seconds here, what should we be looking at and where should we be focusing our activist attention over the next week?
Yeah, two things. One, I would be calling senators and tell them to get off their butts and pass something on COVID-19. We need Mitch McConnell to. Of course, your Democratic senators are more than willing to. It's the Republicans that aren't, so those are the calls. And two, I would call all of your members of Congress and the Senate and express support for the Paycheck Recovery Act. That is the single best way to get 36 million people their jobs back. It takes savings from unemployment insurance and other areas that you wouldn't need if people have a job. It can get it done efficiently like they do in Canada and Germany and England and Denmark. And we still can have that be something that's the grassroots ask for. So I really think people need to talk about the Paycheck Recovery Act for their elected officials.
Great. Congressman Pocan, thanks so much for dropping by again this week. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Tom.
Great talking with you. We'll be right back with what we want to get into. Will America survive Trump's deconstruction of the administrative state right after this?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
So we've got a new video up for regular supporters of our program over at thomhartmann.com, and this is about just a totally bizarre story about these three guys with no VA experience, not even veterans, who are all big shots down at Mar-a-Lago, that Donald Trump has put in charge of the Veterans Administration functionally. And their association, one of them is the head of Marvel Entertainment, their association with Johnson & Johnson and the New York Stock Exchange, and Johnson & Johnson, the big drug company, taking this very, very cheap chemical, ketamine, tweaking the molecule a little bit and rolling it out as a new anti-suicide drug, Spravato, that in clinical trials caused 6 people to die, 3 of them by suicide, and none of the people taking the placebo to die. And now Trump is telling the VA, you have to buy this highly inflated price drug from Johnson & Johnson, and the Democrats want to know what's up with the VA crowd guys. Check it out. It's at thomhartmann.com.
Thank you.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is called Let the People Pick the President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College by Jesse Wegman. And I'm reading from the introduction. This is page 20. But what exactly can we do about the Electoral College? People have been trying to answer that question for more than 2 centuries. Since the first proposed amendment to the Electoral College was introduced in Congress in 1797, there have been more than 700 attempts to reform or abolish it, more by far than any other provision of the Constitution. Only one has succeeded, the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1804 to fix a technical flaw in the college's design, but left it otherwise intact. In the late 1960s, an amendment abolishing the college and replacing it with a national popular vote passed the House of Representatives and came extraordinarily close in the Senate, but was blocked by a filibuster. At the time, 80% of the American public supported switching to the popular vote, as did President Richard Nixon and other top Republicans and Democrats. To sum this litany of failures speaks to itself. I think it's a waste of time to talk about changing the Electoral College, former President Jimmy Carter said in 2000. Carter had supported a national popular vote in the 60s and the 70s. I would predict that 200 years from now we'll still have the Electoral College, he said. Was President Carter right? Is it simply our fate as Americans to remain trapped by the historical quirks of a Constitution that is too easy to revere and too hard to change? Especially after the failed effort in the 60s, when American politics were far less polarized to today, and there was no simple partisan divide over the issue. It's clear that a constitutional amendment is not in the cards. But there may be another way. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, an agreement among states to award all of their electors to the winner of the national popular vote rather than the winner of their statewide vote. The compact will take effect when it is joined by states representing a majority of electoral votes, 270, thus guaranteeing that the candidate who wins the most votes in the country becomes president. The ingenuity of the compact is that it doesn't touch the Constitution. Its target is the statewide winner-take-all rule, currently in use in 48 states. Maine and Nebraska are the exceptions. This rule is what makes presidents out of popular vote losers. It incentivizes presidential campaigns to ignore more than 100 million American voters living in non-competitive states, turning what should be a national electoral contest into a series of bitter, hyper-local brawls. It focuses nearly all campaign spending and policy proposals on a few so-called battleground states, where even a small shift in voting can lead to an electoral jackpot for one side or another. That familiar red and blue map we all obsess over every 4 years, it's nothing but a visual representation of state winner-take-all rules, with each state stamped Democratic or Republican, as though that is its true identity, regardless of how many voters from the other party cast a ballot there. This is bad for democracy, and it should concern all Americans, no matter where they live or which political party they support. In contrast, when candidates know that all votes are equal, and they need a majority of them to win, they're forced to seek the support of all Americans and craft policies that appeal to as many people as possible. The Popular Vote Compact was launched in 2006 and got its first member state, Maryland, the following year. As of October 2019, 15 states in the District of Columbia, together representing 196 electoral votes, had joined. 74 more, and the compact takes effect. So far, only Democratic majority states have joined the compact. And while the 2016 election dealt a significant setback to efforts to enlist Republican-led states, lawmakers of both parties around the country continue to support it and Republican-led chambers have passed it in 4 states. Critics of the compact call it an end run around the Constitution. And it's true that the Constitution's framers never mentioned something like a popular vote compact. They also never mentioned the winner-take-all rule, but that didn't stop the majority of states from rapidly adopting it to benefit themselves. That's the whole point of the compact. The framers gave states near total control over how to allocate their electors. The fact that the compact is an agreement among states also means that, unlike a constitutional amendment, which is effectively permanent, member states may back out if they later decide they don't want to be a part of it. Opponents of the popular vote argue that no matter how you might achieve it, it's not the way our country is built. As the popular saying goes, we're a republic, not a democracy. The Electoral College is one of the core Republican elements of the framers' constitutional design, like the Senate and the Supreme Court, which are there precisely to prevent majorities from running rampant. In other words, majority rule is not our only organizing principle and perhaps not even our most important. There are 2 problems, however, with this argument. The minor one is on the surface and involves terminology. The United States is both a republic and a representative democracy. The 2 terms describe the same thing, a government in which the people hold the ultimate power but elect representatives to make laws, policies, and other decisions on their behalf. The founders used the term republic to distinguish what they were building from a monarchy. For them, democracy generally referred to the direct variety, as in ancient Athens or the New England town meeting, where the people literally make the laws themselves. But American politics at the national level has never been and never will be a direct democracy. So any distinction between the terms today is meaningless. As one political columnist put it, to say that the U.S. is a republic and not a democracy is like claiming to eat beef and pork, but not cows and pigs. The bigger problem with the saying is the implication that lies beneath it. The book, Let the People Pick the President, by Jesse Wegman.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. You know, Lewis Powell back in 1971 in his infamous memo said that Ralph Nader, the guy who wrote the foreword to my next book, The Hidden History of Monopolies and the Destruction of the American Dream, Ralph Nader and Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, exposing how pesticides were, specifically DDT, was killing birds. Lewis Powell in 71 said that Ralph Nader and Rachel Carson were the villains. They were the ones, he said, that were going to destroy America. He said that the growing calls for regulation on, in this case, car safety and pesticide safety to protect American citizens from death and poisoning. He said that these were, and I quote from the Powell memo, quote, an attack on the American free enterprise system, end quote. So yesterday, and what I think is the biggest story of maybe of the month, maybe of the year, and it's being largely ignored by the corporate media. Yesterday, Donald Trump signed an executive order telling all the regulatory agencies, the FCC, the EPA, the Interior Department, the Food and Drug Administration, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I mean, you name it. Every agent, Nuclear Regulatory Agency, every agency that they could, quote, use any and all authority to waive, suspend, and eliminate unnecessary regulations that impede economic recovery, end quote. It was a big wet kiss to his funders in the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, and other industries. And he went on to say in a tweet a little later on in the day, and he said it at a press conference, he wants to make these changes permanent. Now, Steve Bannon famously said that Donald Trump that the main goal of the Trump presidency would be to, quote, deconstruct the administrative state. The administrative state is also known as the federal government. also known as the government of the United States of America. That thing that George Washington had 3 horses shot out from under him trying to help create. That thing that hundreds of thousands of Americans have fought and died for in wars from the Revolutionary War till today. The federal government, no more consumer protections, no more regulation of banksters, no more keeping communities' air and water free from poisons, no more safety rules for toys, no more oversight of slaughterhouses in our food supply. I mean, it's just amazing. This is not the biggest story today. It blows my mind. We are watching Donald Trump deconstruct, to use Steve Bannon's term, deconstruct to take apart our federal government. He's ripping our country into pieces, while at the same time he's pitting Americans against each other to the point that we now have, like the cover story in The Atlantic a couple of months ago was the next American Civil War. I mean, this is where we're at. Serious people having serious discussions about civil war, and you got a bunch of Nazis out there and former Klan members talking about boogaloo, about, a race war these white supremacists want to have. I got to tell you, the foreign autocrats who have given hundreds of millions of dollars to Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, these guys from Russia to the Middle East, and to including Turkey, these foreign autocrats who have funded the Trump crime family and who fundamentally hate the idea of a pluralistic, small d democratic American, a functioning democracy, because they don't have and they don't want functioning democracies. They fear functioning democracies. These guys must be delighted. Trump has destroyed this country more effectively than any of them could have ever dreamed of doing. I mean, even with a war, even with, you name it, Donald Trump is destroying this country from within, which frankly, in my opinion, is why he was put in the White House in the first place. Between the right-wing libertarian billionaires like, the Kochs and their buddies who literally don't believe that there's any role for the government outside of running the military, from them to, foreign leaders like, the president of Turkey, who got all upset when Barack Obama got upset because his goons beat up some demonstrators in Washington, D.C. Remember when that happened? And Erdogan was standing there watching. Oh, isn't this cool? They're beating up people. From Erdogan to Putin to Bolsonaro. I mean, take your pick, right, of strongman governments around the world. They just have to be delighted. Meanwhile, Trump says that he's taking chloroquine, or hydroxychloroquine, and it's, I find this absolutely fascinating. Our own government, we did a study at the Veterans Administration, in one of the veterans hospitals, of 363 veterans who were hospitalized with COVID-19 virus. And they gave half of them chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine and the other half not. And what they found was that the ones who got the hydroxychloroquine died at higher numbers than the ones who didn't. And it didn't shorten the course of their disease or anything. I mean, it had no discernible positive effect whatever. And it killed them, or at least some of them. So Donald Trump yesterday was asked, why? Why are you using this? And this is what he said. He said, a lot of good things have come out of the hydroxy. A lot of good things have come out. You'd be surprised at how many people are taking it, especially the frontline workers. Before you catch it, frontline workers, many are taking it. I happen to be taking it. Question, you're taking hydroxychloroquine? Trump, I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine. Question, right now? Trump, yeah, right now. Yeah, a couple weeks ago, I started taking it. So, the press was asking, why are you doing this? And Brad Parscale, his campaign manager, tweeted out an article from the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons. And the article says, hydroxychloroquine has about a 90% chance of helping COVID-19. Well, gee, you think the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, wow. and this, by the way, was CC'd to Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona, who's refusing to release statistics on deaths in Arizona. So who is the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons? It turns out it's this little tiny right-wing crackpot group. Out of the 1 million doctors in America, 228,000, 250,000 of them are members of the American Medical Association. This group has 2,500 members. And here are some of the positions that they have taken in the past. In 2007, now we have known since 1988 that HIV causes AIDS, right? In 2007, they published a paper questioning that connection. They basically say, no, HIV probably doesn't cause AIDS. In 2008, they published an article saying that Barack Obama tricked Jews into voting for him through hypnosis. In another paper published by the AAPS, they said that nicotine is not addictive. The research, by the way, that they were citing had been financed by Philip Morris. They back in 2002, they said that if a woman has an abortion, it gives her a 30% increased risk of breast cancer. And not true. In fact, there's no association between abortion and breast cancer, none whatsoever. And there have been studies on it. They have promoted anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. I mean, these guys are right-wing conspiracy nut cranks. And Brad Parscale, the campaign manager for Donald Trump, tweeted out their most recent thing, that hydroxychloroquine is the solution to the problem, right? 90% chance it'll help. It's a lie. Do not do this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Taking hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine, if you don't have lupus or malaria, can kill you. And welcome back. Oh my, let's see here. Dave in Lombard, Illinois. Hey Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hey Tom, thanks for taking my call. I would like your opinion on how you think military recruitment is going to be affected by President Bonesbur's action of taking their military benefits away after 89 days and helping the states with this virus. And I'll take my answer off the air. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think this is, we know that Donald Trump thinks of people in the military as props. That's what he uses them for. And I think they're starting to figure that out, or at least I hope they're starting to figure that out. But the simple fact of the matter is that this was, this is just despicable. If you serve in a combat area or in an area where your life is at risk, which is what these guys are doing. I mean, they're going into nursing homes and deep cleaning them. They're doing testing programs in the states. They're literally helping out in hospitals. They're surging help into areas where there's a substantial risk. If you do that, if you serve in those capacity for 90 days, it increases the benefits you get under the GI Bill, so you can get free college or massively discounted college. It also counts toward your early retirement from the military. But if you only serve 89 days, you don't get those benefits. And that's what Trump has done. He has said at the 89th day, it's a hard stop. They all have to come home, period. And I think, people are starting to figure this out. What impact will it have on military recruiting, though? To specifically answer your question, probably not a great deal for two reasons. Number one, this only applies to the National Guard. And the National Guard is not, they don't do the kind of recruiting that the Army, the Navy, they do recruiting, but it's all state-based. And most people joining the National Guard are not, thinking that they're joining that they're off to combat or something like that, although we've been using the National Guard for a number of years. And secondly, when you look at who is signing up for the military, who is voluntarily being recruited or joining the military right now, what you discover is a substantial portion of the people who are joining the military are doing it because A, they couldn't find a job where they came from, They came from one of these very poor red states, and that's why the red states are overrepresented in our military. Or two, they couldn't get health insurance. They couldn't find a job with benefits. Or three, they couldn't afford to go to college, and they see the military as their way to go to college. All three of those categories essentially fall into this bucket that Thomas Jefferson identified back in the day when he said, "I hope I shall never live to see the time when young men in my country would be willing to be paid would be willing to be shot at for a sixpence." In fact, he went on about how, it's a great thing about America that we have, people, volunteering for our military, not because they want the pay, but because they want to serve their country. And that this was the spirit of the Greek democracy, this was the spirit of the Roman Republic, when the people themselves are filling the ranks of the military. This is a great and noble sign for the country, when they're doing it out of love of country. Well, there are still many people who join the military out of love of country. But a significant minority, and perhaps even a small majority, are actually there for the money, basically, which is really, really unfortunate. It's not an indictment of the military. It's an indictment of the private sector in the United States. We'll be right back. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. We have a special video up over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program, and it's about how a letter that the IRS sent out to 3.9 million Americans saved 700 lives. And you're like, wait a minute, the IRS saved 700 lives? How did that happen? Well, it has to do with Obamacare, and it's a fascinating story. And it turns out that this analysis of this IRS mailing was actually the first time that the federal government has done a study that actually proved that people having access to health care produces fewer deaths. For every 1,648 people who got the letter, there was one fewer premature death. I'll explain the whole thing in the video. It's as I said, it's available over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and it is really worth checking out. And it's a great ad, essentially, for a national health care system. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. A few other things that I think are really worth noting in the news today. Elaine Chao, I mentioned this briefly yesterday. It got some good coverage last night in the news, but I think it really, most people don't know what was actually going on. Elaine Chao is the Secretary of Transportation. As the Secretary of Transportation, she can funnel things like highway dollars, new rail systems, mass transit. She can funnel that kind of stuff into whatever state she wants. And she has been using that discretionary power to funnel transportation money into the state of Kentucky, so that there are signs all over Kentucky saying, this road is being repaired by, as a result of effort, money brought to the state by Mitch McConnell, and who's the, senator from Kentucky. And it's just, this is purely for the political help of her husband, which is illegal. So the Inspector General, the cop on the beat, the equivalent, I've told you this story before about in the cop shows, when Internal Affairs is on its way. Oh my God. Well, that's what Inspector Generals are. And when the Inspector General started looking into Elaine Chao funneling Department of Transportation money into Kentucky inappropriately to help her husband's political chances, she complained to Donald Trump, and he fired the guy. He fired the Inspector General. And on a Friday night when, in the hopes that nobody would notice. And now we're starting to notice. And I think that's a pretty big deal. Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell had all the Republicans had a meeting with Donald Trump at the White House yesterday. The buffet I told you about, it was just announced. It turned out it wasn't a buffet, it was boxed lunches. But still, nobody wore masks. They didn't socially distance. This is getting weird, right? This is just getting weird. And Donald Trump at that meeting, speaking of the $600 a week that has been added to unemployment checks for 36.5 million Americans now who are officially unemployed. If you're getting unemployment through your state unemployment department, and if you've been able to fight your way past the computer system that's designed to deny you in Florida, for example, and in most red states, but Rick Scott, when he was governor of Florida, really pioneered this system of creating a really difficult to use computer interface, online internet interface, and then not only making it hard for people to sign up for benefits, but then saying, and every week you've got to come in and tell us what you did this week in terms of trying to find a job. And if you fail to do that, you will lose your benefits. And then you log on every week to try to do that. And this is only working certain hours of the day, and it only holds in a certain number of people. And so people can't upload, the work that they did trying to get a job. And as a consequence of that, they lose their benefits. And then they got to start all over again. This is what Rick Scott put together in Florida. There's a very similar system in place in Texas. There's similar systems in place in virtually all the red states. They pretty much all make it really, really hard to get unemployment benefits. But if you have succeeded in getting unemployment benefits, you're getting an extra $600 a week right now through the federal government. And this is something that Nancy Pelosi put together in the first or the second stimulus bill. Well, Lindsey Graham has said that will be renewed over my dead body or over his dead body. And yesterday, Donald Trump in this private lunch with Republicans said that he was opposed to it too. He would veto any legislation that has it in it. Now, at the same time that the president, the Republicans in the United States Senate, and for that matter, the Republicans in the House who all voted against this stuff, at the same time that the entire Republican Party is saying, screw the American worker, no more unemployment benefits, no more benefits of any kind, they need to get back to work. Quit being wusses. Right? If you want to walk into the White House, you have to have an instant COVID test. But anywhere else, you're a wuss, right? So at the same time this is happening, a company out of the UK actually commissioned a poll in the United States. So One Poll is the polling company, and they surveyed 2,000 individuals in late April, which is a pretty good sample for a national poll. It's enough to get reasonably tight numbers. You're in the margin of error of plus or minus 2 or 3%. 76% of self-identified Republicans, 84% of self-identified Democrats said that the United States, it's time now for the United States to have universal single-payer health care. Universal single-payer health care, 76% of Republicans, 84% of Democrats. 63% of all Americans said that student loans should not have to be paid back during this crisis. 79% of all Americans said the federal government should do more to help those who are unemployed. 58% said that there needs to be more financial support. Of course, that was skewed heavily towards Democrats. And then I mentioned this at the top of the first hour. Germany passed a law last night. Actually, I'm not sure if it's a law. It's Germany to change labor legislation. Yes, they passed a law basically outlawing cheap labor in meatpacking plants, because they had this outbreak among these immigrant workers from Romania who are willing to work for a fraction of what Germans would work for. They had this massive, it's the same thing that we've got here in the United States with immigrant workers, from south of our border, melting down, these outbreaks of COVID in meatpacking plants in Germany.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
The difference between us and Germany is that Germany's doing something about it. They're banning the practice. We're just banning testing. We'll be back.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had master slaves, feudalism had lord serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, Dr. Michael Mann is here on heat, sea levels in the Amazon. Oh my. Environmental scientist and writer Dana Nuccitelli drops by on Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans documentary. He explains how it peddles dangerous climate denialism. And journalist David Sirota is exposing the coronavirus cover-up. In Geeky Science, I'm discussing the importance of biodiversity and how the future of the Amazon may depend on tapir poop. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available.
In our latest video for folks who support our show over at ThomHartmann.com,
Zoom meeting.
It's pretty mind-boggling, actually. The candidate Trump back in 2016 said, "I'm not going to."
Best part is Plexiderm going clear and last for
now he is blocked.
interesting news for you to share with you at the top of the next hour as well, or actually after our first guest in the next hour. But Donald Trump yesterday went nuts on Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. She is sending out applications for absentee ballots to all 7.7 million registered voters in Michigan. It doesn't mean that everybody gets an absentee ballot. It means that everybody has a hoop that they can jump through to get an absentee ballot, which is going to further suppress the vote because it's going to mean that only the most motivated voters are going to fill out that, application for a ballot and send it back in. So, that's kind of the downside of it. And there's never been any studies anywhere that indicate that there is a partisan advantage to vote by mail. But nonetheless, Donald Trump went nuts. He said, I will ask to hold up funding to Michigan if they want to go down this voter fraud path. And she replied, Jocelyn Benson, she says, I have a name. It's Jocelyn Benson, and we sent applications, not ballots, just like my GOP colleagues in Iowa, Georgia, Nebraska, and West Virginia. And then she goes on to say, by mailing applications, we've ensured that no Michigander has to choose between their life, between their health and their right to vote. Voting by mail is easy, convenient, safe, and secure, and every voter in Michigan has a right to do it. And by the way, this was voted on with a 2/3 majority as a ballot initiative in, I believe it was 2018, recently. So, but the story gets more interesting after that. Walter Schwab is tweeting this little bit of federal law. And I quote, whoever uses any part of any appropriation made by Congress for work relief, or for increasing employment by providing loans and grants for public work projects or exercises or administers any authority conferred by any appropriation act for the purposes of interfering with, restraining, or coercing any individual in the exercise of his right to vote at any election shall be fined under this title or imprisoned. In other words, Donald Trump just broke the law. Speaking of broke the law, the whole Republican thing about lock her up, Hillary Clinton, was that she used a private email server. Well, it's starting to get real interesting. It turns out that Mike Pompeo, who's also Secretary of State. Keep in mind, Hillary Clinton used a private email server when she was Secretary of State. She didn't use it for official business. She used it for personal business, but there were some official emails that got on it because, she was included in things. And she turned all those over to the government, by the way. This whole thing of, she vanished them or, whatever, those were the personal ones. But in any case, the whole point, Trump's whole campaign for president in 2016 was she should be in jail because she used a private email server. Well, it turns out Mike Pompeo is doing the same thing as Secretary of State. And he's doing it for these, fancy schmancy meetings, these dinners that he's having, these very expensive, very elegant, very, all expenses paid balls. I mean, just these huge dinners that he's having with celebrities and all, 100% Republicans, not a single Democrat ever invited. His wife has been organizing these things, and it's all being done through a private Gmail account, Susan Pompeo's private Gmail account. That's illegal. And we now learn that Ivanka Trump was also using her private email. She said that she didn't realize it was illegal. While transitioning into government, she was giving an official account, but until the White House provided her the same guidance they had given others who started before she did, Ms. Trump sometimes used her personal account, almost always for logistics and scheduling concerning her family. Hey, lock her up? Lock him up? Lock them up? I'm not hearing it. It's very strange. Steve in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today?
I was wondering, and I was going to ask Mark Pocan this too, is I'm going to contribute some money to, like, Amy McGrath. Am I better to give it to her directly, or would it be better for me to give it to, like, the Democratic Senate committee?
You should give it to her directly, or to her campaign. Okay. That way you know where it's going to end up. You know that it's going to do that. Targeted contributions can be meaningful, Steve. And thanks. That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. In fact, I just got an email from Joe Biden. I signed up, as you know, back in 2015, I gave $5 to Donald Trump to get on his email list. That's one of the things, one of the easy ways to get on the list where they're just going to give you everything. They're going to send you everything. And so I did the same thing with Joe Biden and several other Democrats, back during the primary. And I got an email today from the Biden campaign asking for a contribution. And the email was an animated picture on the cover of the email, on the front of the email, that was Joe Biden talking to Elizabeth Warren. And I thought, okay, I want to send a signal to the Biden campaign that I think he should pick Elizabeth Warren as his VP. And so I just made a contribution to the Biden campaign. So, it's like targeted, using if you have a little extra money and you're going to donate it to political campaigns, doing it in a way that might send a message can be useful, I think. Vince in Hampton, Virginia. Hey, Vince, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, can you hear me?
No, you're very, very muffled. I'm going to put you on hold, and Joyce can work it out with you. You're on line 4. Elizabeth in Miami, Florida. Hey, Elizabeth, what's up?
Hi. Thank you for all you do. And I wanted to ask you about ranked choice voting, and if you could educate about that, because it's, we have such a group of characters that are running for office, and I thought that if you could tell us more about ranked choice voting, it might help us.
Sure. I'll give you a quick snapshot. This comes up maybe every month or so, and it's a good one. It's a really important one, and there needs to be more discussion about it in the United States, Elizabeth. So thank you for bringing the topic up. Excuse me. The way this works, the example I'll use, because it doesn't have much, huge emotional charge to it, is the 2000 election. In the 2000 election, Louise and I lived in Vermont, and I knew Vermont was going to go for Al Gore, and I really liked Ralph Nader and the things he was saying. He was running on the Green Party, and so I voted for Ralph Nader, and Louise voted for Al Gore. We split our ticket. My vote for Ralph Nader, when Ralph Nader had only got like 5% or 2% of the vote or whatever it was, basically was thrown away. With ranked choice voting, my ballot, the ballot option I would have been given was who is your first choice, who's your second choice, and sometimes who's your third or fourth choice, depending on how many candidates there are and how they're doing it. Let's just say it's their first two choices. So I would have said, okay, my first choice is Ralph Nader, but my second choice is Al Gore. So they collect the ballots and they count them all up, everybody's first choice. And if Ralph Nader didn't hit 15% or a threshold defined by the law, it varies, but typically it's around 15%. If Nader didn't hit 15%, then all those first choices who chose Nader would lose that first choice and their second choice. So my second choice would have become my official vote. So Al Gore would have gotten my vote after all, but everybody would have learned that there was a certain number of people in Vermont who really liked Ralph Nader. And what this does is it opens up the political process, because it doesn't mean that third-party participants in an election anymore are spoilers. So Ralph Nader, if I vote for Ralph Nader, it doesn't take a vote away from Al Gore and give it to George Bush functionally. Instead, I end up voting for Al Gore anyway because he was my second choice. So sometimes this is referred to as instant runoff voting too, because it's almost like you've got a runoff election within the election. San Francisco does this as a city. There are 300 towns around the United States that do it. In every case, it was put on the ballot by the Green Party. The Green Party has been at the forefront of this. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party both hate this, and for the simple reason that it diminishes their power, which in my opinion is the reason why we should all be supporting ranked choice voting. They'll end up, with the votes anyway until they don't. But, people say, hey, how come Germany has, 10 different political parties? How come there's, 5 major political parties in Israel? Why can't we have that? Well, because we don't have ranked choice voting or a parliamentary system. So that's how we get it. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And I believe the state of Maine is doing ranked choice voting now. I may be wrong. It may be just part of Maine, but it's moving along. It's moving forward. And welcome back. Dennis in Shorewood, Illinois. Hey, Dennis, what's up?
Okay, hi, Tom. I got a question. It's probably only going to be germane if we take the presidency and the Senate, and it's on the back burner now because of all the coronavirus stuff. But they were making a push, I thought, to get rid of that cap on salt.
Right.
I mean, that was just a way to punish the blue states, and I live in Illinois, which is a high-tax state. And so I was wondering if in your talks with the Progressive Caucus or anybody else, if you've heard if that's still going to be a priority. And I have a second question, if I may. Is there a question you could ask Dr. Michael Mann? On the climate change, you got guys like this Dr. Lindzen from the Heartland Foundation. They say, there's no problem. Okay.
Heartland is a scam organization.
I know.
They are funded by the fossil fuel industry. They used to be funded by the tobacco industry, and they used to claim that tobacco doesn't cause cancer.
I know that.
It's BS.
Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, you got this guy called Dr. Guy McPherson, who says if we try to reduce the pollution, it's all over. Yeah. So I was wondering if he could speak to that, because that makes people think like, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, I've had these conversations with Michael Mann before, and I've interviewed Guy McPherson on this program several times, and I know Guy McPherson. And Guy is you can find those interviews on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Yeah. And Guy is taking the position that it's already too late and that civilization is doomed and we should all just be nice to each other and
I know.
Hospice. Yeah. I'm not ready to throw in that towel, and neither is Michael Mann. I can tell you that right now. And
neither am I.
I think most climate scientists are not ready to throw in that towel. So Guy is kind of considered a fringe figure. But when you look at the science and the math that Guy is presenting, he makes a pretty strong argument. But I'm still not willing to go there. With regard, what was your first question again?
Salt.
Getting rid of the salt
Democrats
tax.
Still going to try to get rid of that cap.
Yeah, that repeal of that provision that caps the deductibility state and local taxes at $10,000 a year. Repeal of that is part of this $3 trillion HEROES bill that the Democrats just passed in the House of Representatives that Mitch McConnell is refusing to take up in the Senate. Yes, that is part of it. So that would solve that problem. That bill does a lot of really, really good stuff. I mean, it doesn't go as far as a lot of progressives would like. It's only got a single $1,200 payment rather than $2,000 a month, you know, for that sort of thing. But, it was written on the theory that this might be something that we could actually get through the Senate. And I think we need to, you know. I think we very much need to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. Dennis, thanks for the call. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about or what Dennis and I are talking about, when Trump did his giant tax cut back 2.5 years ago, to punish blue states, which are generally the high tax states, red states, you know, Texas and Florida, for example, don't even have an income tax. So to punish the high tax states, right now, if you spend if you spend $20,000 in state taxes, you can deduct that from your income on which you calculate your federal taxes. Under this new rule that Trump added to his tax cut, you can only do that deduction up to $10,000. And so it basically sticks it to the high tax states, and it hurts the citizens of those states. And Congress is trying to undo it. We'll be right back. Hey, Thom Hartmann here. I have a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream, and Ralph Nader wrote the foreword. It's available for pre-order wherever you find fine books. So in our latest video for supporters of our program over at thomhartmann.com, you'll find a riff about a fellow named Errol Graham. He's a 57-year-old African English individual who starved to death recently in the United Kingdom. The neoliberal Thatcher policies are apparently echoing through the British system now in a rather substantial way, the same way that Reaganomics is echoing through the American system. And we've got tens of thousands of Americans who die every year because they lack health care or they can't afford copays and things. And we have literally millions of children in America who are malnourished or even go to bed hungry every night. It's pretty breathtaking stuff, and I think you'll find the rant particularly interesting or useful, and hope you can share it with your friends when you pick it up. It's over at thomhartmann.com. Thanks again for supporting our program. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Bob in San Jose, California. Hey, Bob, thanks for listening to AM 910 iHeartRadio there in San Francisco. What's up?
Well, I have a modest proposal. Approximately 100 years ago, we had this rural electrification program to essentially bring electricity out to farms and other places of low population density where the cost of wiring was high, and it was essentially a federal program. And we've had another program in the 50s that had to do with interstate highways. And that was a way of, and funded by the Department of Defense, which greatly improved transportation across the country. The COVID-19 virus has proven, among other things, that we really need internet to everyone. It has to be low cost or even free of cost, and it has to be wide bandwidth and reliable, because there are a whole lot of people in rural areas that can barely get effectively dial-up speeds today, and we need something to make that happen. So this should be, I would say, Department of Defense. This Homeland thing.
Broadly speaking, Bob, I completely agree with you. And just a couple of data points: the Department of Defense did not fund the Eisenhower highway system. There's this story that kind of persists that Eisenhower sold that by saying that these highways could be used as landing for bombers and things during, if there was a war. It's all just vanishing hitchhiker story stuff. Eisenhower wanted to have an interstate highway system that would, increase commerce, that would provide a a strong infrastructure base for a strong economy going forward. That's how he sold it. That's how it was funded. And secondly, you're absolutely right about the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, which came out of the New Deal. Then in the 1950s, I believe it was the RTA. And you probably should double check when actually the RTA went into effect. My recollection is it was Eisenhower, but it might have been FDR or Truman. And that was the Rural Telephony Administration. And that brought telephone lines to rural areas. So there's, which is a much closer precedent actually than the REA, which was electricity, because telephony was basically, that generation's version of the internet. And that was paid for by the federal government also. In both cases, it was because private companies controlled the generation of electricity and transmission of it, and the telephone systems, and those private companies were unwilling to invest in rural areas, and so the federal government did it for them. And if you look at Chattanooga, Tennessee right now, and this is really worth spending a little time with the DuckDuckGo search machine on the internet. Chattanooga, Tennessee, and they're not the only one. They're the only one whose name I can, is right at the top of my head. But as a city, as a municipality, created a municipal broadband system. Everybody in town has access to it. It's very, very cheap. It's super high speed, super high quality, among the best in the United States. World-class service. And I absolutely agree with you, Bob. This should be a right. This is, everybody in America should have access to high-quality internet. I'm totally with you. Bob, thank you for that. Donald in Fairbanks, Alaska. Hey, Donald, what's up?
Oh, hi there, Tom. I just heard that one man talk about Guy McPherson, and because I just saw you on the computer. I didn't, but I've watched your interview, I think, a couple times with Guy, and I just heard what you said with him. You said you're not totally convinced yet, but anyway, I live in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I'm living right here where it's happening, but and I did it for that reason. But I'm also trying to get people to start farming with us. We're going to grow, vegetables and wheat and barley. But anyway, that's in the Tanana Valley, up next to that glacier. But I'll bet that. Okay, let's look at it this way. Just in Michigan today, you have all this rain. You've got an enormous amount of. You have two, not one, but it's two of them broke. So
yeah, no, I think there's actually a third one that either has broken or is on the verge. Donald, what you're describing is climate change and the increasing severity of the weather, and it's all true. The question is whether it's going to lead to the death, the extinction of the human race, and that's where I'm skeptical. I do acknowledge right off the top that this could be a civilization-ending event. It could be that what we call modern civilization, that 500 years from now or even 100 years from now, we're all living, the human population is radically downsized to a few million or a few 100 million people, and that they're living tribally, Stone Age. I mean, that's entirely possible. But Guy is saying that, the entire human race is going to go extinct. I can't go there.
There may be some survivors, but I mean, what you just the Georgia Guidestone, I'm sure you've read that and studied a little bit. I have not. Look it up. It's an interesting thing. It's whoever did that, because nobody knows, was he said, I say he, but you're supposed to keep the population at 500 million, but good luck on that one.
Oh, you're talking about that Neolithic rock thing, right?
That's right.
Yeah. I am familiar with that. Donald, thanks for the call. This whole thing around climate change is something we need to be taking seriously. I mean, climate change is going to do more damage to us than the coronavirus, and we need to be focusing on that too.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters slaves, feudalism had lords serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is Leah Garcés, the president of Mercy for Animals. Mercyforanimals.org is the website. The Twitter handle is Mercy for Animals, or Leah, Leah_Garcés, Garces. Leah, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's my pleasure. I see this article, millions of U.S. farm animals to be culled by suffocation, drowning, and shooting. And I think most people think that this is really a story about how the coronavirus is disrupting our supply chains, and people getting it in meatpacking plants are slowing down the rate at which they can move animals through this factory farm system. But I see this, and I'm guessing you do, as more of an indictment of the way that we are producing our food supply than it is anything else. Your thoughts on this, Leah?
Yeah, I think that what's happening here is factory farming and these industrial slaughterhouses are being exposed. It's like the emperor has no clothes, and they're being exposed as a vulnerable system that treats both workers as expendable and farmed animals as something to be thrown away. So what's happening across the country right now is workers are standing shoulder to shoulder while the rest of us are 6 feet apart. So it's no surprise these are becoming hotspots for COVID-19. And the pandemic is also severely affecting animals. So as the slaughter plants shut down due to worker shortages, there's this backlog of millions of animals who are supposed to be slaughtered. The result is millions of them instead are being slaughtered in-farm in these horrific ways and then thrown away like they're trash.
Wow. So what's the solution to this? I mean, this is front and center right now. But if you talk to people who live in the communities where these giant factory farms are located, you find that pigs are no longer pooping like normal. Instead, it's just continuous diarrhea, and you get these giant pools, these lagoons of waste. The same thing with cows, that is actually toxic and is contaminating groundwater and is making the air stink miles away, destroying property values. Communities trying to push back against it. I mean, is this? We're not going to flush eating meat out of our culture any day soon. Although we can all work to minimize it as much as possible. But is a return to small farms? I mean, basically banning factory farms, is that one solution? How do we deal with this?
Yeah, it's a hard problem to solve, but a lot of people are trying to solve it now, and there's a lot of motivation to solve it now that it is exposed as this really horrific system. And as you said, as you're pointing out, it's highlighted right now, but the problems of pollution, worker abuse, animal abuse, it's really benefiting so few people. And that has been going on for decades. So it feels like the whole issue has really come to a head right now. And we actually have some opportunities for the first time in my career, to really reform this system. And there's a couple ways to do that. One is through some of these COVID-19 relief packages that are coming out. And what we're really advocating for is money shouldn't go into just propping up a bad system, propping up a system that's, as you said, polluting communities, that's hurting workers, that's hurting animals. Instead, those relief packages that are coming out really need to think about reforming a broken food system. Yeah, my wife, we grew up in the 1950s as children. And her grandmother, her mother grew up on a farm in central Michigan, and it was her grandmother's farm, and she used to go to the farm as a little kid, and it was a 100-acre farm, and they were pretty much self-sufficient. They had a couple of cows, and they had chickens and stuff like that, but they literally ate what they grew, and they treated their animals well, and as well as a food animal can be treated, I suppose, and slaughtered them in ways that they could live with, that were as painless as possible for the animals. And nonetheless, my wife and her brother used to name the animals, which made her grandmother crazy. But back then, I don't believe there were factory farms. I mean, you said this is, just a moment ago, you said this has been going on for decades. Isn't this whole factory farm thing, industrial agriculture, using massive amounts of antibiotics and injecting them with hormones and stuff, isn't this all really recent? This really has come about in the last 40 years, or did I just not notice them back in the 1950s and 60s? No, you're right. I mean, this was factory farming as a methodology of creating protein was really created after World War II, and there were food shortages. So there was a bunch of subsidies created and incentives for consolidating in this way. But it sort of blew up, and particularly the pig industry and the chicken industry consolidated into this monopoly in our food system. And so you have a lot of the farmers, for example, in the chicken industry are living in complete debt. They're basically indentured servants, and they can't get out from under the thumb of big meat. And you can't have those small farms as easily. You can't just walk up to a slaughterhouse and bring your chickens. You can't. To be contracted. Right. Would that have been back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan suspended in '83? He suspended enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The result of that was these big ag companies were manipulating prices and running small farmers out of business. That was the decade when my wife's grandmother sold her farm, in fact. And you had Willie Nelson doing his Farm Aid concerts and things. Mm-hmm. And this was the birth of the major industrialization of animal food, food from animals, right? Yeah, it certainly accelerated then, and yeah, you're remembering correctly, and it was accelerated at that point, but it still goes on. In fact, some of the big chicken companies right now are being investigated for price fixing, where they're keeping the price of chicken at a high rate just so they can pocket more money. And there's a whole federal investigation going on into that right now. I mean, it continues. And this past month, we saw Trump issue an executive order just to force slaughterhouses to stay open. And what that executive order actually did is it shields meat companies from liability, where all these workers are getting sick and dying. They're now going to be protected. And that actually functioned right away. Smithfield had a lawsuit where workers, it's a very serious thing where our protein production system, first of all, is so inefficient and puts so many people, so many animals in our environment at risk, and yet is propped up and supported and subsidized by our taxpayer dollar. And so we're fighting really, really hard at this moment because we feel like there's just this rare glimpse of hope where funds could instead go to reforming this broken food system. And we're particularly the HEROES Act, which is out for consideration right now. It's just it passed the House. It passed the House. It's going to the Senate now. And right now, the language includes repaying the industry for all of that horrible on-farm mass slaughter that we talked about at the beginning of this. And we think citizens around the country should be writing to their senators and say, that's outrageous. Taxpayers should not be paying for the industry to keep doing what it's doing in the way it's doing it in such a harmful way. Instead, they need to really hit reset on this system. It's time. It's time.
Yeah. Leah, we just have a few seconds left, but you mentioned a lot of this is happening out of view. It's happening out of view because it's illegal to take pictures of a lot of these places. Are those laws changing?
Some of them are getting worse. They're called ag-gag laws. It makes it illegal for us. It makes it a jailable offense to take photos of abuse inside a factory farm.
Amazing. I mean, this is such a corrupt industry. It's just mind-boggling. Leah Garcés.
It really is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Leah. Is president of Mercy for Animals, mercyforanimals.org, and Mercy for Animals, FOR Animals is the Twitter handle. Thank you, Leah. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I got to tell you about people born back a century ago, and what's the latest email from Donald Trump to Fred Flintstone? And welcome back. There we go. James in Shelton, Washington. Hey, James, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I'll do a little bit of the meta model here. Well, what prevents, do you think, the Democrats and the Democratic news media and newspapers from just running a little ad with a black border in the lower right-hand corner and list all the things Trump has said in the last few days, and then followed by the contradictions and the dissembling and the perversion of what's really going on, so people could see that the guy is a liar, that he does twist the truth. Something like that that's always in the paper or in videos or cable news.
There's this group, James, called the Lincoln Project, which Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway, is one of the directors of, I believe he is.
I know that.
And I think maybe Bill Kristol and some of these other never-Trumpers are involved. They have been producing ads that do exactly what you're describing. And, Trump it in his own words, indicting himself with his own words. The Democratic Party still, their efforts are scattered. They don't have a lot of cash. They're being outspent and out fundraised massively by the Republicans and the Trump campaign. And they're going to have a big fight on their hands. So I don't see them producing these things. But there are, there's this Republican group, and then also Indivisible. The Indivisible groups, indivisible.org, is worth checking out because they're doing a lot of the same kind of stuff. But I'm with you, and I understand your sentiment, and I completely agree with it. James, thank you for the call. Scott in Burien, Washington. Hey, Scott, you're on the air.
Hey, Tom, let me take you off speaker.
Scott?
Can you hear me?
Let me put you on hold then. Let's see here. Joanne in Seattle. Hey, Joanne, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I just want to say I appreciate your program. And then I want to say, for me, the way I see it is unless the legislators from the city level up to the Fed, if they don't start changing some laws or attempting to, so we can get him out of there, then nothing's going to be done. But you and I's generation is, I'm your same age, and we're, our generation, I see it as the me generation. And we've just been so much into us that we haven't paid attention, and we feel like defeated. We can't do anything. But, I think we can by encouraging laws to be changed. For example, the way the opioid addiction thing has destroyed cities. You live in Portland, I live in Seattle. It's just horrible. I believe that these people need treatment, but to do that, you have to change some laws. So that's my point.
I'm with you.
And there.
I completely agree with you, Joanne. And there's a lot of laws that need to be changed. I mean, starting with things like, how do we deal with opioid addiction? But there is so much work to be done. And, tragically, we have Republicans in charge at the Senate and the White House right now. And the only thing they believe in doing is shoveling money to the billionaires. We'll be right back. Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. Hey, we have a brand new video up at thomhartmann.com for the people who are subscribers or supporters to our program. And this one's about national health insurance and why and how we really need a single payer national health care system, whether you call it Medicare for all, or you call it single payer, or you call it whatever. Medicare for all, it has a lot of appeal because generally speaking, Medicare is positively viewed. That's what they call it in Canada. It's called Medicare. And, which makes sense, care for people using medicine. We would save at least $150 billion a year just on billing. You've got hospitals in the United States that have entire floors devoted to billing. Hospitals in Canada have one desk with, 1 or 2 people sitting at that desk, handling the billing. It's just crazy. And people would get better care, they get more comprehensive care, our entire nation gets healthier, and there's a whole bunch of essentially bullet points to build this argument for Medicare for all over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out right now. Okay, a couple of other things that I wanted to share with you. Actually, I think I'm going to hold this one until tomorrow, this piece of this. Okay, here's our mail. We got mail, right? I don't know. We used to have a mail music thing, but not here from home. Anyhow, I get this. This is from official Trump. This is the Trump campaign, right? Dear Fred, Obamagate is the biggest political crime in our nation's history. Barack Obama will forever be remembered as the disgraced former president who used federal law enforcement in an attempt to hurt his political opponents. His administration, including sleepy Joe Biden, illegally spied on President Trump at his 2016 campaign and then lied about it. We can't let them get away with it. The president trusts what you think, Fred, which is why he's asked us personally to reach out to you and get your thoughts on how he should proceed with handling the greatest hoax of all time. We're sending the first 75 responses to our quick one-question poll directly to the president's phone for him to review. Do you think the Justice Department should investigate Barack Obama and his administration? Yes or no? President Trump is really counting on your input, Fred. The American people know if the Obama administration illegally spied on President Trump and his campaign, there's only one way to find out. We deserve the truth. Do you think the Justice Department should investigate Barack Obama? That's the first one. And then the second one, which came the next day, and this one came from Donald J. Trump. Oh, how the tables have turned, Fred. Joe Biden used the federal government to illegally spy on my 2016 campaign and to further the Russian collusion delusion. Can you believe it? First, I was accused of colluding with the Russians. Next, the Democrats wasted your time and money with a 3-year witch hunt. Then they impeached me for being a perfect president. After that, I was acquitted. I did nothing wrong. And now there's evidence showing that Sleepy Joe is the guilty one. The liberals have always been trying to take me down. And more importantly, they've been trying to take you down, Fred. We are halfway through the month, and now that Sleepy Joe is a certified crook, I want to make a statement so big that even while he's hiding in his basement, he won't be able to ignore us. For the next hour, all contributions will be 500% matched. Please contribute any amount in the next hour to make a huge statement, and your gift will automatically be 500% matched. And then it's got my donor file and all that kind of stuff, and isn't that cool? It's really interesting because, Donald Trump is trying to gin up this scandal. And in the process, the Republicans declassified yesterday this memo that Susan Rice wrote to herself after a meeting with Obama, and she was the national security advisor who was being replaced by Michael Flynn. And she wrote a memo to herself basically summarizing a meeting that she had had with the president and some members of his cabinet, in which they were, concerns had been shared with them by the FBI that Michael Flynn was having a very high frequency of contacts, phone calls and meetings with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador. And they're like, why is this going on? This is not something that national security advisors should do. And so the question was, do we have to be worried about passing top secret intelligence along to Michael Flynn out of fear that it may end up in the hands of Russian intelligence? And it seems to me that by declassifying this, they just kind of proved the point that this was a legitimate investigation. I mean, it's like weird stuff was going on. And what we found out later, Michael Flynn pled guilty to. Actually, he didn't plead guilty to this. They chose not to charge him for being an unregistered foreign agent because he pled guilty to a larger crime, which was lying to the FBI. And, or maybe it's a smaller crime. But in any case, he's pled guilty to lying to the FBI. Twice, in fact, he pled guilty to that in open court and confessed his crimes. And what he was lying to them about were these meetings with Kislyak that had to do with the sanctions that Obama was putting on the Russians. So I think this thing is blowing up in his face. But then the grift continues. Then, this is an email that Sean got, and she forwarded it along to me. And it says, Sean, are you looking for a Medicare plan that suits your needs? You may upgrade your coverage for the year 2020 under the newly proposed Trump Care plan. Recent changes to the plan offer seniors a chance to exercise more freedom in choosing their coverage. Well, remember I told you back in 2005, the Bush administration succeeded in partially privatizing Medicare by creating this thing called Medicare Part C, also known as Medicare Advantage plans, which are not Medicare. They are private insurance plans offered to people over 65, used to be illegal, now they can, offered to people over 65 that have all the restrictions of any private for-profit company. If you go out of network, then you have to pay the bill. You've got deductibles, you've got co-pays, you've got, if you get really, really sick, you need long-term care, they will drop you like a hot potato. It's a scam. But almost a third of Americans over 65 have signed up for these Medicare Advantage plans because they advertise them so aggressively on television. These are very profitable things because they rip you off. And they say, oh, you get free dental and you get free eye exams. Yes, but if you get really sick, we won't pay for your hospital room. But now, one of these companies is taking one of these Medicare Advantage plans, calling it Trump Care, and marketing it. I mean, this borders on fraud, but it's amazing. Anyhow, I'll pick up your calls right after the break. It's coming up on 28 minutes
You're
past the hour.
listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with your thoughts on my thoughts and the news of the day, and whether this country will survive Trump deconstructing the United States after this.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Measuring What Counts, the Global Movement for Well-Being by Joe Stiglitz, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, and Martine Duran. And this is from the first chapter labeled Overview. The high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, also known as HLEG, builds on the analyses and recommendations of the 2009 Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, also known as the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, in highlighting the role of well-being metrics in policy and encouraging a more active dialogue among economic theory and statistical practice. The report makes explicit the often implicit assumptions hidden in statistical practices and their real-world consequences. Its central message is that what we measure affects what we do. If we measure the wrong thing, we will do the wrong thing. If we don't measure something, it becomes neglected, as if the problem didn't exist. There is no simple way of representing every aspect of well-being in a single number in the way GDP describes market economic output. This has led to GDP being used as a proxy for both economic welfare, like people's command over commodities, and general welfare, which also depends on people's attributes and non-market activities. GDP was not designed for this task. We need to move beyond GDP when assessing a country's health and complement GDP with a broader dashboard of indicators that would reflect the distribution of well-being in society and its sustainability across the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Excuse me. The challenge is to make the dashboard small enough to be easily comprehensible, but large enough to summarize what we care about the most. The 2008 crisis and its aftermath illustrate why a change in perspective is needed. The GDP loss that followed the crisis was not the temporary one-off event predicted by conventional macroeconomic models. Its effects have lasted over time, suggesting that the crisis caused the permanent loss of significant amounts of capital, not just machines and structures, but also hidden capital in the form of lower on-the-job training, permanent scars on young people entering the labor market during a recession, and lower trust in an economic system rigged to benefit a few. Different metrics, including better measurements of people's economic insecurity, could have shown that the consequences of the recession were much deeper than the GDP statistics indicated, and governments might have responded more strongly to mitigate the negative impacts of the crisis. If, on the basis of GDP, the economy is perceived to be well on the road to recovery, as many governments believed in 2010, one would not take the strong policy measures needed to support people's living conditions suggested by metrics that inform on whether most of the population still feels in recession. Nor would one take measures to bolster the safety net and social protection in the absence of metrics on the extent of people's economic insecurity. These failings in the policy responses to the crisis were compounded by overly focusing on the consequences of public spending in raising government's liabilities, when this spending could take the form of investment, increasing the assets in governments and countries' balance sheets. The same follows when measures of unemployment do not reflect the full extent of a country's unused labor resources. The beyond GDP agenda is sometimes characterized as anti-growth, but this is not the case. The use of a dashboard of indicators reflecting what we value as a society would have led, most likely, to stronger GDP growth than that actually achieved by most countries after 2008. This book also looks at progress in implementing the recommendations of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission since 2009, identifying areas that require increased focus by statistical agencies, researchers, and policymakers. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by the international community in 2015, clearly go far beyond GDP. But their 169 policy targets and more than 200 indicators for global monitoring are too many to guide policies. Countries will have to identify their priorities within the broader UN agenda and upgrade their statistical capacities, which, even in developed countries, are insufficient to monitor whether the agreed-upon commitments are being met. The international community should invest in upgrading the statistical capacity of developing countries, especially in areas where country data are needed to assess global phenomena, such as climate change or the world distribution of income. Inequality in income and wealth has today a central role in policy discussions in ways it did not in 2009. But important progress is still needed in a range of areas, such as measuring what happens at both ends of the income distribution, integrating different data sources, and measuring the joint distribution of income, consumption, and wealth at the individual level. When looking at inequality, it's also important to look at differences between groups. These are called horizontal inequalities, at inequalities within households, and the way resources are shared and managed, which are especially important in the case of wealth. We should also look beyond inequality in outcomes to inequality of opportunity. Inequality of opportunity is even more unacceptable than inequality of outcomes, but the operational distinction between the two is fuzzy, as we don't observe all circumstances that shape people's outcomes and are independent of their efforts. The book Measuring What Counts by Joe Stiglitz and Friends.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, Dr. Michael Mann is here on heat, sea levels in the Amazon. Oh my. Environmental scientist and writer Dana Nuccitelli drops by on Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans documentary. He explains how it peddles dangerous climate denialism. And journalist David Sirota is exposing the coronavirus cover-up. In Geeky Science, I'm discussing the importance of biodiversity and how the future of the Amazon may depend on tapir poop. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. So it turns out back in November, the spy agencies in the United States were notifying the Trump administration that something's going on in China. Looks like another SARS outbreak. Maybe we should get ready for this. It was ignored. I've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for the supporters of our program that basically goes through the whole timeline, all the way from, actually going back to 2018 when Trump disbanded 3 different anti-pandemic agencies in the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Council, and the executive branch. Just closed them down, fired the people. That was the end of that. How he ignored the intelligence in November, he ignored the intelligence in December, he ignored the epidemic now coming into the United States in January, he ignored it in February, just going the blow-by-blow timeline. And I think it's really worth having it all in one place, a good recap, a good summary of this that you can refer to and you can share with your friends. It's all over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out. And welcome back. Rose in Chicago. Hey, Rose, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Just wanted to ask you, do you think that Trump's solid voting bloc of farmers will stick with him during and even after this pandemic like they did back, even when many of them were facing bankruptcy and even losing their farms during his stupid trade wars? I mean, it was unbelievable back then. Many of them that were interviewed said they would vote for him again when they were losing their farms. Do you think they'll stick with him this time?
Probably, Rose. The factor, the variable that's always missing from these equations when they're discussed in the media is the power of Fox News and right-wing hate radio, the ability to basically create a cult around grievance. Grievance about black people. Trump is refusing to hang Obama's new picture in the White House. I mean, it may go up on the wall someplace, but traditionally there's a ceremony where they do it. He's refusing to do that, our first black president. It's just like this largely racialized grievance that they sell on right-wing hate radio and on Fox News is
Can I ask you a
powerful
Fox
stuff.
News?
Sure, go for it.
Just because I don't have cable or satellite TV. I know it's hard to believe. So I've never really seen Fox News. I guess I'm one of the lucky ones, maybe. So I wanted to ask you maybe about that. Do the Trump followers that watch only that, do they not even hear stories or see any of the images of the ventilators or the refrigerated trucks being used as temporary morgues, or do they see it and just blow them off as fake? I mean, like I said, I've never seen it. So was it just political pundits all day, or is there any quote?
It's a little bit of both, Rose. It's a little bit of both. It's mostly, those kinds of stories are mostly completely missing over on Fox and on right-wing hate radio. And when they are shared, they're shared as the exceptions to the rule or as examples of, it's just black people dying. And by the way, black people are dying disproportionately. Or it's just old people who are dying. And again, they are dying disproportionately. And so, their spin on all this is you don't have to worry about this if you're white or if you're under 60. You don't have to worry about it. But one of the things that's interesting about that is that Trump's support among people over 60 right now is collapsing. And I think it's collapsing largely because that is the message that they're trying to push out there. Rose, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. It's nice to hear from you. Rich in Cedro Woolley, Washington. Hey, Rich, what's on your mind today?
A couple of things real quick apropos to your letter to Fred. I would call republicanism, Reaganism, but especially now Trumpism, the politics of projection. Take, for example, Pelosi asked for X million dollars to help out the states, and the Republicans say, you're just going to give that to all your rich friends. Well, that's what they would do. The other question, actually, it was a question for Pocan earlier today, but Is there a way that the House or the Congress can change the definition of small business from not based on number of employees, but more on, say, gross income or even payroll?
Well, Congress can do anything they want, in making these definitions. I'm with you, though. I remember Louise and I back in the 80s or in the 90s. We owned an ad agency, an advertising agency in Atlanta. We owned a travel agency before we sold that, and then we started an ad agency. And the ad agency had, I think, probably 13, 14 employees, something like that. We were a small business. We were large for small ad agencies. Most are 2- and 3-person shops, the small ones. And so we were doing pretty good-sized business. But I wanted to expand the company. I wanted to buy some equipment, actually. I wanted to buy some typesetting equipment that cost about $100,000. And so I went to my bank and I said, "Can I get a small business loan?" And he says, "No, you're too small. To be a small business, to be defined as a small business under the SBA, you had to have," and I forget what the criteria was, but I think it was something like 50 employees or something like that. And our company was just too small. And we had a gross income that was, well over $1 million a year. But it just, it wasn't enough. So I think small businesses really are the heart and soul of this country, at least traditionally have been. And that's why I wrote this book on monopolies, which is coming out in a month and a half, The Hidden History of Monopoly, Who Stole the American Dream, or How Big Business, destroyed the American dream. And it's an issue that we need to be addressing, and I agree with you that redefining small businesses would be a good start. Rich, thanks for that. Mike in Olympia, Washington. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. I was just wanting to address the term climate change and whether you know if that was converted from global warming by right-wing think tanks, and whether we should address the direct effect of pollution rather than give them climate change, which now they say, well, the climate changes all the time. And, I feel like we gave them fodder for that.
Right. The decision to move from global warming to climate change was broadly across the scientific community, as I recall. This is a question that probably Michael Mann could answer better than me, but this is my recollection. And the reason why was because it is not just warming up around the country and not just warming up local areas. Places are getting much, much colder. You get these bomb cyclones in the winter where, when we lived in Washington, D.C., we had a couple of winters out of the 7 years we lived there. I think 2 or 3 of the winters were like record cold. And that was because of global warming, because of climate change. It was because the jet stream was collapsing as a result of the Arctic going ice-free and warming up. So what they wanted to do is emphasize the fact that it's unpredictable. Some places are going to get floods that didn't used to get floods. Other places are going to get droughts that didn't used to get droughts. And therefore, they're going to have wildfires and things like that. All that kind of stuff. So I don't think that it was a result of right-wing messaging.
Okay, I thought I had read something that they converted because it sounded less threatening. And I agree. I never actually liked global warming. I thought pollution was a much more direct thing, but I understand all the different.
In fact, call it carbon pollution. I would be all in favor of just referring to it as carbon pollution, because that is what is producing, by and large. I mean, there's other gases, the fluorinated chloro, whatever they are, the gases that they use for like refrigeration and stuff. But principally, it's carbon.
And I feel like that's the more direct threat to people's health. But I just wanted to get that in because I heard us talking about climate change earlier. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a good one. Thank you, Mike. Nice to hear from you. Deb in Detroit. Hey, Deb, what's up?
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Can you hear me?
What's on your mind? Just fine.
Okay.
Yes, what's on your mind?
I got 2 things, buddy. I finally called you. I love your show.
Thanks.
I was in Japan in 2001 on a TDY, and they had free Wi-Fi on the subway everywhere. And then my next thing is I was at a VA thing about 3 months ago or 4 months ago, and guess what? There was those people with Advantage, the one that you have to pay for. And I thought, oh my God, like, why did they let them in there?
I don't understand.
That Advantage one where you have to pay? I was so
you mean
mad.
Medicare Advantage programs?
Yeah,
or are you talking about...
They were sitting there in a booth, and I thought, oh my gosh, What a ripoff.
Oh. Yeah, well, it is. It's very profitable selling Medicare Advantage because, it's a scam. And so there's a bunch of companies that have jumped in on it. The biggest provider of Medicare Advantage plans in the country is United Healthcare out of Minnesota. They cut a deal with AARP, an exclusive deal, which has made hundreds of millions of dollars for AARP and hundreds of billions of dollars for United Healthcare. And, they're both getting very, very rich off it. It's remarkable. And yeah, your point on Japan's internet is spot on. Internet is ubiquitous in Japan. It is. South Korea actually has the very best internet service anywhere in the world, including in all their rural areas. But Japan is very, very well covered. And, most of the rest of the world gets internet really cheap. We pay more than twice as much for internet here in the United States as any other developed country. And our service is typically 1/5 to 1/4 as good. This is part of the $5,000 a year tax that all American families pay every year for as a consequence of giant monopolies. It's a monopoly tax. I opened my book on monopolies with that story. And, your lousy internet service, you can track that right back to Reagan in 1983, stopping the enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And here it is. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll continue picking up your phone calls right after this break. Stick around. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option.
To Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We will get through this. I've got some really remarkable statistics that I want to share with you on tomorrow's program. Stick with me. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Rob in Mount Iron, Minnesota. Hey, Rob, what's on your mind today?
Not much, Tom. It's where, thanks for fitting me in. It's where I just got the one question out here. It's where if you declare bankruptcy or I declare bankruptcy, we get our credit scores ruined. How many times have Donald Trump declared bankruptcy? And the whole thing is where does anybody know his credit score? Everybody has one.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never seen any evidence of a Donald Trump's credit score, but he has never declared bankruptcy. His companies have declared bankruptcy. There was a concern that he may have to declare a private personal bankruptcy back in the 1990s when his casinos were going down. And what kind of idiot loses money on a casino? But in any case, there was some concern that he may have to declare personal bankruptcy, and he was bailed out by Deutsche Bank on that. And it looks like Deutsche Bank was being backstopped by some Russian or Ukrainian oligarchs. So, money coming from the former Soviet Union. So,
perfect point. The only reason that he's alive right now is because basically it's where the Russians are financing Deutsche Bank so that Donald Trump can be able to finance his businesses.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And Seth Abramson has done some good work on this. He was on our program earlier this week. And David K. Johnston has done some absolutely brilliant reporting on that and has written a book about it. So you should check that out. Rob, thanks for the call. Scott in Burien, Washington. Hey, Scott, what's up?
Hey, Tom, can you hear me this time?
Yes, sir.
Sure. Yes, I'll try to go quick. You and Bill Maher have talked about this. Trump, losing both the Electoral College and a popular vote, but still getting a second term, like, for example, Pence refusing to certify the vote. Why do you think the mainstream media is not covering it more? Do you think they're afraid that if they did, that could actually discourage persons from voting? Because I'm on speakerphone, I'll just take your answer off the air. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Scott. I think that what's going on here is that it's like wishful thinking on the part of the media. They believe that Trump won't go that far. And so they don't want to give it credibility. On the small chance that giving it credibility might cause him to go that far. And that's really dangerous thinking. I mean, that's how the media was treating Hitler in the 30s. That's how the Italian media was treating Mussolini in the late 1920s. It's how the Spanish media was treating Franco. And you see this mistake being repeated over and over and over again. You had opposition media in the Philippines as Duterte was coming to power and when he came to power, and they were calling him out. They were pointing out that he'd killed people when he was the mayor of, I think it was Mindanao. He was the mayor of a town in the Philippines, and then, he went from there to being president of the country. And that he personally had killed people and had bragged about it. And, they thought that this was like, a great scandal that they were revealing and they were outing him. And what happened was, the public was like, okay, so what? And then, when he became president, he went after them. And you've got reporters now who are in prison in the Philippines. So, the media in the United States, if Trump gets reelected, is in for a hell of a surprise. It's going to get really bad, really fast. But let's hope that doesn't happen. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. I'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. Did you know that the Second Amendment was written to protect the slave patrols in South Carolina and Georgia back in the day? It's in my new book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment, available wherever you find great books. Hey, we have a new video over at thomhartmann.com for people who are supporters of our program. On this one, I'm digging into, or actually kind of taking issue with, a new article that's over on thenation.com titled, Could Coronavirus End Globalization? And they've got a bunch of analysts who are weighing in on this sort of thing. And my take is that this is going to be even bigger than that. This depression that we are sliding into is being softened right now by the Federal Reserve throwing $6 trillion at America's largest corporations. 1/3 of all economic activity for a year in the United States. Twice the annual federal budget. The Fed has just parked $6 trillion with a couple of hundred big companies. And it's just masking what's coming. It's going to get bad, and it could become fascist. And so check it out. It's over at thomhartmann.com, for the people who support our program. Thank you. Welcome back. Tom in Jerusalem, Israel. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today? Tom in Jerusalem? I am not hearing Tom. Okay, I'm going to put Tom on hold, and we'll let Joyce sort that out. He's on line 5, Joyce. Howard in New York City. Hey, Howard, what's up?
Hi, yeah, I was thinking, hopefully it's a good idea. I'm sure you'll tell me. Get Biden some proactive exposure that he's not getting now. Start to fix the PPE problem, the testing problem, and at the same time criticize Trump's awful behavior and policies. Here's what I'm thinking. It would take Biden, if he hired a computer programmer, a good program, in 1 week to get an online real-time program where every hospital in the United States could enter, this is how many masks I have, this is how many I need, this is how many tests I can give, this is how many I need. Once a week, Biden gets some kind of exposure and announces the facts, the reality. Because the fact that we don't have testing now and tracing now is absurd. They're opening things without testing and tracing. So what do you think of that idea?
I'm with you, Howard. I think it's a good one. There's kind of everybody seems to have an opinion about what Joe Biden should be doing right now. I think that he's sort of in limbo until he has a vice presidential nominee or candidate. Typically that happens during the convention, which is, a month or so down the road. But frankly, I think that he's probably going to announce somebody in the next week or two. And then the campaign can really start rolling along. And I'm looking forward to that very much. Howard, thanks for the call. Karen in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Karen, what's up? Karen? Well, this is weird. We're getting a lot of people who are listening to their phones or to their radios, not their phones. Chris in Seattle, Washington. Hey, Chris, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I'm just concerned about the amount of PPE and disinfectants that we are producing and that we're going to need for this. All of this stuff is produced as disposable. It's one-time use kind of stuff. And we are using, multiples of what is normal and are going to continue to do that. And we haven't built in, again, not thinking forward, what are we going to do? Maybe we shouldn't be using, what are all these chemicals that we are, the amounts of disinfectants that even people just in our homes are using now. I'm hearing that, the sewage systems are seeing overwhelming amounts of these chemicals. When restaurants reopen, think about how many we're going to be producing there. And then just like I said, the PPE, mask, paper mask, thousands and
so
thousands.
What's your point,
Chris?
How
do we get ahead of this? How do we,
we have to bring manufacturing back to the United States, in my opinion. I don't think that our septic systems are going to be overwhelmed by people flushing too much isopropyl alcohol down the drains by washing their hands.
We're now putting into the environment. Period. Not just the sewage systems. I mean, literally, these chemicals. Hand sanitizer. When are we going to run out of aloe vera to make with it? We're again producing. We're not thinking ahead. Right now we're going. Okay, we have to have all this, and we do. But what are we going to do in 6 months or a year?
I'm with you, Chris. This is the absolute failure of any kind of planning whatsoever is the signature failure of the Trump administration, whether it has to do with, pick a policy, any policy that they've been involved with over the years. Their failure to plan is the thing that is the signature of their administration. Tom in Jerusalem, you want to try it again?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, the mic mute came on. I think you're really going to have to do. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you have to force Biden's hand. And FDR was forced to desegregate the black union defense industries in 1940 by a threat of black workers to have a 1 million man march on Washington. You have so many workers who have got problems, whether it's in hospitals, whether it's teachers in schools. I think they need to get radical to force his hand in a progressive direction, so that he
that
does
will
more
happen. Tom, your point is well taken, and that would happen, I think, if Joe Biden was president. But as a candidate, do you want to be protesting Joe Biden when he's a candidate?
No. I'm just saying. I think that if people went into the streets, and I really think you need to take it to the streets. I don't think it's just the voters,
they have tried this. There's been several meatpacking plants where they've had strikes and people are, they did actions and those people got fired. And it didn't get coverage.
They got to go big.
One of them got coverage on Rachel Maddow's show, and that was it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, Tom.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't either. It's a tough one. But Tom, thank you very much for the call. It's nice to hear from you. And we got to wrap it up here. We'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow I want to tell you, this is, I got Phil Proctor's newsletter. And he's got this extraordinary story of what you would have experienced if you were born in 1900. And there's a huge lesson for today in this. I want to share that with you tomorrow. And in the meantime, have a great afternoon. Check out Phil Proctor's newsletter. It's called Planet Proctor. And he's, the old Fireside Theater guy. And, we'll be back tomorrow. Same time, same place. And in the meantime, tell your friends about Progressive Media. Tag You're It. Have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself and the people around
you. You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.